Most men would have kept riding. Most men would have told themselves the wagon was empty and the sound was only the desert wind moving through rotten wood. But Cole Mercer had lived too long with silence to mistake it for anything else. The wagon sat alone at the edge of the dry basin, nearly half a mile off the trail, crooked on one broken wheel beneath a dead cottonwood tree that looked like lightning had split it years ago. No horses, no campfire, no tracks fresh enough to matter. Just an old freight wagon with its canvas cover hanging loose on one side, and the slow creaking sway of wood moving against wood every time the wind crossed the open land. The sun had already slipped below the western ridge, leaving the desert painted in cold blue shadows. Night came fast in northern Arizona that time of year. 1 minute the rocks still held warmth. The next, frost started forming along the edges of the sagebrush. Cole pulled his horse to a stop at the top of the ridge and stared down toward the wagon without moving. Ranger shifted beneath him, uneasy. The gelding's ears twitched forward, then flattened slightly. Animals noticed things before people did. Cole rested one gloved hand on the saddle horn and narrowed his eyes toward the basin floor. Something about the wagon felt wrong. Not abandoned wrong. Worse, still wrong. He should have kept moving. The nearest town was another 11 miles north, and the temperature was dropping hard already. A smart man riding alone after dark did not investigate strange wagons sitting in empty country. A smart man minded his own business. Cole had spent 15 years becoming exactly that kind of man. He turned Ranger slightly back toward the trail. The leather saddle creaked softly beneath him. Cold wind crossed the basin carrying dust and the faint smell of old wood. Then the wagon moved. Not much, just enough for the left side to shift once with a tiny groan of rusted iron. Cole froze. Ranger lifted his head sharply. The movement stopped. Silence settled over the desert again, so completely Cole could hear the distant cry of a night bird somewhere beyond the rocks. He stared another long moment before exhaling slowly through his nose. Probably an animal. A coyote trapped inside maybe. Or loose cargo shifting under rotten boards. Nothing more than that. He touched his heels lightly against Ranger's sides and started back toward the trail. Thump. The sound came low and weak from inside the wagon. Not loud enough to echo. Not strong enough to carry far. But human. Cole stopped instantly. Ranger stopped with him. Another long silence followed. Then something scraped softly against the inside wall. A dragging sound. Slow. Uneven. Cole felt the muscles tighten along the back of his neck. He looked across the empty basin again. No riders. No smoke. No movement except wind pushing sand across the rocks. He reached down and loosened the revolver at his hip without drawing it. Damn it, he muttered quietly to himself. The wagon sat maybe 200 yards away now, dark against the fading desert light. Cole studied it the way a man studies a rattlesnake he hopes is only a stick. The trouble with the frontier was simple. Sometimes innocent things looked dangerous. Sometimes dangerous things looked innocent. And sometimes men used both to bait fools into getting close. Cole knew that better than most. 3 winters ago outside Silver Creek, he had opened a wagon door for a crying woman and nearly died for the kindness. Ever since then, he trusted distance more than people. Another soft sound drifted across the basin. This time it barely reached him at all. A tiny bump against wood. Then something else. A voice. So faint he almost thought he imagined it. Mama. Cole's jaw tightened. He closed his eyes for half a second. Just long enough to feel the old tired weight in his chest he spent every day trying to outride. Then he opened them again and turned Ranger toward the wagon. Slow this time. Careful. The wind whispered across the dry grass as horse and rider started down into the darkening basin together. The basin floor grew colder with every step Ranger took downhill. Frost crackled softly beneath the horse's hooves, thin white lines spreading across the dirt where the last warmth of daylight finally gave up against the desert night. Cole kept one hand near the revolver at his side and the other loose on the reins while his eyes stayed fixed on the wagon ahead. Up close, it looked worse than it had from the ridge. One wheel leaned crooked deep in the sand. The canvas cover had been patched so many times it sagged in uneven strips. Rust coated the iron bands along the sides, and the long tongue where horses should have been harnessed rested half buried beneath drifting dust. Nobody had moved this wagon in a long time, and yet something inside it had spoken. Ranger stopped 10 feet away on his own and refused to go closer. Cole slid from the saddle slowly, boots landing soft against the frozen ground. The cold hit harder down in the basin. He could smell old wood now. Dust. Wet canvas. Something else underneath it all. A stale, sour smell like clothes left too long in rainwater. Cole looped the reins loosely around a dead branch and stepped toward the wagon one careful pace at a time. The silence pressed against him hard enough to feel alive. No movement came from inside anymore. No voice. No scratching. Nothing. He reached the rear doors and stopped. Chains wrapped tight around the handles. Thick iron chain. Heavy padlock. Locked from the outside. Cole stared at it for a long moment without breathing. His eyes narrowed slightly beneath the brim of his hat. Freight got tied down. Supplies got secured. But people did not lock themselves inside wagons from the outside. He crouched low near the wheel and brushed 2 fingers across the dirt. Tracks, old ones mostly. Boot prints. Horse prints. Too many to count clearly after the wind had eaten at them for days. But one thing stood out. Small footprints. Barefoot. Child-sized. Cole straightened slowly. Jesus, he muttered under his breath. The chain rattled softly when he touched it. The sound echoed strangely inside the wagon like the space beyond the doors was packed tight instead of empty. Cole listened carefully. At first there was nothing. Then very faintly came the sound of breathing. More than one. Uneven. Weak. He felt something cold settle in the middle of his chest. Anybody in there? He called quietly. No answer. The wind crossed the basin again, dragging dust across the rocks. Cole waited. Another few seconds. I said, is anybody in there? This time something shifted inside. Tiny movement. Then silence again. Fierce silence. The kind that knew better than to answer strangers. Cole removed one glove and rubbed his hand slowly across his jaw. He had heard that kind of silence before in mining camps after cave-ins. In sick rooms during winter outbreaks. In places where people stopped believing help was coming. His eyes dropped again to the chain. Whoever locked this wagon wanted whatever was inside hidden. Maybe abandoned. Maybe forgotten. Ranger snorted nervously behind him and stamped once against the frozen dirt. Cole glanced back toward the ridge line instinctively. Darkness covered most of the desert now. The last band of blue light was fading fast behind the mountains. If this was a trap, it was a patient one. But traps usually made noise on purpose. This did not feel like bait. This felt like desperation. Another sound came from inside the wagon. Softer this time. A cough. Small. Weak. Followed by another from deeper inside. Then a child's voice barely louder than breathing whispered through the cracks in the doors. Please. Cole closed his eyes briefly. He heard fear in that single word. Exhaustion too. Not performance. Not manipulation. Just the last little piece of hope somebody had left. When he opened his eyes again, his expression had changed. The distance was gone from it now. He stepped back from the wagon and reached down beside the wheel where an old iron bar rested half buried in the dirt. Probably left there months ago by whoever abandoned the wagon. Cole wrapped his fingers around it and tested the weight once in his hand. The chain clinked softly in the wind. Inside the wagon, nobody moved. Nobody spoke again. They were waiting to see whether this man outside would leave like all the others probably had. Cole looked once more toward the empty desert around him. No riders. No lanterns. No sound except the wind and Ranger breathing behind him. Then he stepped back toward the locked doors and slid the iron bar between the chains. The iron bar groaned against the chain as Cole forced his weight into it. Rust flaked loose and drifted. Onto the frozen dirt below. The padlock held it first. Then came a sharp metallic crack that echoed across the empty basin loud enough to make Ranger jerk against the reins behind him. Inside the wagon, every sound stopped instantly. No breathing. No movement. Nothing. It was the silence of people too afraid to hope. Cole pulled the broken chain free and let it fall softly beside the wheel. For a second, he only stood there with one hand resting against the cold wood of the door. The wagon felt colder than the desert air itself. He could feel the chill through his glove. Slowly, carefully, he pulled one side open an inch. Darkness waited inside. Thick darkness. The kind built from days without sunlight. A smell rolled out immediately. Sweat. Wet clothes. Hunger. Human breath trapped too long in a sealed space. Cole had smelled abandoned mining tunnels cleaner than this. He opened the door another few inches. Somewhere deep inside the wagon, somebody whimpered softly. Easy now, Cole said quietly. I'm not going to hurt anybody. No answer came back. He could barely make out shapes inside. Blankets maybe. Crates. Something piled close together near the far wall. Then two pale eyes appeared in the darkness. A child staring through the narrow opening without blinking. Cole froze where he stood. The eyes belonged to a girl no older than 12. Dirt streaked across her face. Her blonde hair hung in tangled knots against her cheeks. She looked thin enough the shadows almost swallowed her whole. But it was not the dirt or the thinness that struck Cole hardest. It was the look in her eyes. Not crying. Not panic. Just exhaustion so deep it looked older than childhood should allow. The girl lifted one shaking hand toward the crack in the door like she expected it might close again any second. "Please," she whispered. "Do not shut it." Cole swallowed once before answering. "Nobody is shutting nothing." The girl stared at him several long seconds as if trying to decide whether men still told the truth. Behind her, something moved in the darkness. Another child coughed hard. A weak, rough sound that rattled deep in a small chest. Cole opened the door wider. Cold night air spilled into the wagon, and several tiny figures flinched backward at once from the sudden light. Children, more than he thought. Small shapes huddled beneath torn blankets and old feed sacks. One little boy covered his face with both hands like he expected to be struck just for being seen. Another child curled against the wall holding what looked like a broken doll made from cloth scraps. Cole counted quickly without meaning to. 1, 2, 4, 6. His chest tightened. There were at least 8 children packed inside the wagon. Every single one looked hungry. A tiny girl near the back lay limp against an older boy's shoulder while he held her upright with both arms. He stared at Cole with hard gray eyes far too sharp for a child his age. "Who are you?" the boy asked immediately. Cole noticed how the others watched that boy before anyone else. "The protector. The one forced to grow up too fast. Name is Cole Mercer," he answered calmly. "I was riding north and found this wagon." The older girl slowly shifted forward on trembling knees. "Are they with you?" she asked. "Who?" "The men." Cole felt the temperature inside the wagon drop another 10 degrees at those words. "No," he said quietly. "Ain't nobody here except me." The children did not relax. Not one of them. The little girl in the back still had not moved. Cole crouched lower near the door so he did not tower over them. "How long have you kids been locked in here?" Silence followed. Then the older girl answered in a voice barely above breathing. "I do not know anymore." Her lips were cracked white from thirst. There was dried blood along one sleeve where the skin underneath had rubbed raw against rope or wood. Cole looked around the wagon slowly. Empty water bucket tipped sideways. Crumbs scattered across the floorboards. A blanket soaked through near the corner from where rainwater must have leaked inside days earlier. No lantern. No food left. Nothing a person would leave if they planned to return soon and care for children. His jaw tightened beneath the shadow of his hat. "What is your name, miss?" he asked gently. The girl hesitated before answering. "Lydia." Cole nodded once. "All right, Lydia." Then, another sound rolled faintly across the desert outside. Distant. Soft. But unmistakable. Horse hooves. Every child inside the wagon reacted before Cole did. The fear hit them all at once like cold water. Lydia spun toward the darkness behind her so fast the wagon rocked beneath her knees. The older boy tightened both arms around the little girl in his lap, while another child covered her mouth with both shaking hands to stop herself from crying. Outside, the distant hoofbeats rolled softly across the basin again. Still far away, but coming closer. Cole turned his head toward the darkness beyond the wagon doors. The desert night carried sound strangely. Sometimes riders a mile off sounded nearby. Sometimes nearby riders vanished into silence. He listened carefully. 3 horses maybe. 4. Hard to tell. Ranger lifted his head sharply beside the dead tree and gave a nervous snort toward the ridge line. The older boy's voice came low and tight from inside the wagon. "They came back before after dark." Cole looked at him. "Who?" "The men with the gray coats." Lydia swallowed hard. "They said if we made noise they would leave us out here." Her words trembled despite how hard she tried to keep them steady. One of the smaller girls buried her face against Lydia's shoulder. Cole studied every frightened face in the wagon one by one. None of this fear was fresh. These children had been scared for too long already. He stepped back from the doors and looked again toward the basin rim. Still nothing visible. Only darkness spreading over rock and sand beneath the pale moonlight beginning to rise over the eastern hills. But the hoofbeats had been real. How many men? Cole asked quietly. Noah answered this time. For usually. Usually. That word sat wrong in Cole's chest. Usually meant this had been going on a while. He looked again at the little girl in Noah's arms. Her blonde curls stuck damp against her forehead. Even in the cold air, sweat glistened along her temples. Fever. Bad one too by the look of her breathing. Small fast breaths. Noah noticed Cole watching her and shifted protectively. Her name is Ellie, he said sharply like a warning. She is sleeping. Cole nodded once without arguing. How old is she? 5. Ellie coughed weakly against Noah's coat, but never opened her eyes. Lydia brushed trembling fingers through the little girl's hair. She stopped waking up much today. Cole exhaled slowly through his nose. He had seen fever move through cattle camps before. Children went downhill fast in cold weather without water or food. He glanced around the wagon again. 8 children. Weak. Frightened. Half frozen. Whatever choice he made next mattered. The hoofbeats came again louder now, echoing faintly through the basin. Ranger stamped hard against the dirt and tugged nervously against the reins. Cole made his decision instantly. All right, he said calm and low. Everybody stays quiet now. Noah narrowed his eyes immediately. What are you doing? Cole stepped to his saddlebag and pulled out 2 canteens and a cloth bundle wrapped tight with string. Buying us a few minutes. The smell of dried beef and cornbread drifted through the cold air as he opened the bundle. Inside the wagon, several children stared at the food without moving. Not one reached for it. Hunger had made them cautious. Lydia looked at the bread like she was afraid it might disappear if she blinked. Cole tore off a small piece and handed it toward her first. Slow, he warned gently. Empty stomachs bite back if you rush them. Lydia hesitated before taking it carefully with both hands. Her fingers shook so badly crumbs fell into her lap. The younger children watched her chew like they had forgotten. People still ate food slowly instead of fighting for it. Cole passed Noah the canteen next. Little sips for Ellie. Noah did not take it immediately. Why are you helping us? The question hung in the cold air between them. Cole glanced once toward the darkness outside before answering. Because somebody ought to. Noah studied him another long moment before finally taking the water. Ellie swallowed weakly against the rim after Noah tilted a few drops carefully against her lips. The tiny sound nearly broke something in Lydia's face. She looked away quickly toward the wagon wall before anyone saw her eyes filling. Then from somewhere beyond the basin came the faint orange flicker of lantern light moving between the rocks. One lantern, then another. Cole's expression hardened instantly beneath the brim of his hat. The riders were closer than he thought. The lantern lights drifted slowly across the ridge like ghosts moving through the dark. One disappeared behind a rock outcropping. Another reappeared farther north. The riders were searching. Cole stepped away from the wagon doors and pulled the canvas flap partly closed again, leaving just enough space for air to pass through. Inside, the children watched him without speaking. Fear had made them quiet in the way wild animals went quiet before storms. Listen to me careful. Cole said low enough only they could hear. Nobody makes a sound unless I tell you. Lydia nodded immediately. Noah did not. He kept one arm around Ellie while his eyes stayed fixed on the growing lantern glow outside. You are going to leave, he said flatly. Cole looked at him. No, everybody leaves. The words came fast now, sharp from exhaustion more than anger. They say they will help, and then they leave after they hear about the men. Cole held the boy's stare a second longer than most men would have. Noah could not have been older than 11, but there was nothing childish left in his expression anymore. Just suspicion held together by exhaustion. Cole reached into the wagon and handed him the last piece of cornbread anyway. Feed the little ones first. Noah hesitated before taking it. The lantern lights outside shifted again, lower now, dropping into the Basin trail. Ranger tossed his head nervously beside the tree. Cole moved toward his horse fast, but without panic. Panic spread quicker than fire around children already terrified. He untied the reins and rubbed one steady hand along the gelding's neck. Easy boy. Ranger snorted hard into the cold air. Cole glanced toward the ridge again. He could hear voices now. Faint. Too distant to make out words. But men were definitely coming. His jaw tightened beneath the shadow of his hat. He had one horse. 8 frightened children. 1 broken wagon. And men somewhere out there who already knew how to find this place. Inside the wagon, Ellie suddenly coughed hard against Noah's shoulder. The sound tore through the silence sharp enough to make every child freeze. Lydia covered her own mouth instantly, like she could somehow stop the noise after it already escaped. Cole turned back fast. Ellie's small body trembled beneath the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Noah tried to calm her quietly. Shush now. But the little girl's breathing had turned rough and uneven. Fever was climbing. Cole climbed halfway into the wagon without thinking about it. The children flinched backward immediately except Noah, who held his ground beside Ellie. Cole pressed 2 fingers gently against the little girl's forehead. Burning hot. Worse than before. How long has she been sick? He asked quietly. Lydia swallowed hard. Since the river crossing. What river? I do not know the name. Her voice shook. The men got angry because she could not walk fast. Cole stared at Ellie a second longer before pulling his hand away. The child weighed almost nothing beneath the blanket. He had carried heavier saddlebags. Outside, one of the distant riders shouted something across the basin. Another answered. Closer now. Cole looked toward the doors. Time had run out. He stepped back down from the wagon and reached into his saddlebag again. His fingers closed around a small silver pocket watch before he stopped himself. The watch had belonged to his father. The only thing he still carried from home, besides an old photograph folded deep in his coat pocket. He stared at it briefly in the moonlight, then shoved it back inside the bag and pulled out a box of rifle cartridges instead. Priorities changed fast in hard country. He checked the rifle resting in the saddle scabbard and loaded it calmly while the lantern lights grew larger between the rocks above the basin. No wasted motion. No trembling hands. Just the slow, steady movements of a man who had learned long ago that fear only made bad situations worse. Behind him, Lydia spoke quietly for the first time since the riders appeared. Mr. Cole. He glanced back toward her. Yeah. Her fingers tightened around the tiny scrap of cornbread she had not eaten yet. If they come back, her voice weakened. Please do not let them close the doors again. The words settled heavy in the cold air between them. Cole looked at the frightened faces crowded inside the wagon. Children trying not to cry because crying took energy they did not have left. Ellie half-conscious against Noah's chest. Lydia shaking despite how hard she fought it. Then he looked back toward the approaching lantern lights crawling down the ridge like predators tracking wounded animals through the dark. Something old and buried shifted deep inside his chest. The lonely part of him that usually rode away from trouble instead of toward it. He slid another cartridge into the rifle and answered without raising his voice. That door stays open now. The riders reached the lower ridge a minute later. Cole counted 4 lanterns moving between the rocks exactly like Noah had said. 4 horses too by the sound of it. Heavy animals climbing carefully over loose stone. The men were not rushing. That frightened Cole more than if they had been charging hard through the dark. Calm men usually believe they already owned the situation. He stepped beside Ranger and rested the rifle across one forearm while keeping his eyes fixed on the Basin trail. Behind him, the children inside the wagon barely breathed. Even Ellie's coughing had faded into weak, shallow breaths against Noah's coat. The moon climbed higher above the desert, pale silver light spreading across the sand and broken stone. Enough light now for shapes to form clearly at a distance. Cole finally saw the riders emerge between 2 black rock formations at the north edge of the basin. Gray coats, white hats, dust-covered horses, 1 lantern swinging from each saddle horn. The man riding in front sat tall and straight in the saddle with a thick scarf wrapped around his neck against the cold. He slowed his horse the second he noticed the wagon doors standing open. The others stopped behind him. Nobody spoke at first. Wind drifted across the basin carrying the smell of dust and cold sage. Cole stood still beside the wagon wheel, one hand loose against the rifle stock. The lead rider's eyes moved slowly from Cole to Ranger 2. The broken chain lying in the dirt. Evening, the man finally called. His voice carried easy and relaxed across the open ground. Too relaxed. Evening, Cole answered. The rider tilted his head slightly. Looks like you found our wagon. Our wagon. Noah had been right. Cole kept his expression flat beneath the brim of his hat. Looks abandoned to me. One of the men behind the leader laughed softly at that. Wool broke 3 days back, the lead rider said. We've been trying to get supplies together in town. Cole glanced once toward the wagon behind him. Funny place to leave children. Silence followed that. The men exchanged quick looks beneath their hats. Tiny movements. small enough most people would miss them. Cole did not. The leader finally smiled, though nothing warm reached his eyes. Orphans, he said. Church group out of New Mexico. We are transporting them north. Cole said nothing. The man kept talking. Hard trip. Little ones get nervous easy. We lock the doors at night, so nobody wanders off into the desert. Behind Cole, Lydia made the faintest sound against her breath. Not quite a gasp. More like fear trying to stay silent. The lead rider heard it anyway. His eyes shifted toward the darkness inside the wagon. Lydia, he called suddenly, voice smooth as oil. Everything all right in there? Every child inside froze completely. Cole could feel it without turning around. The rider smiled again when nobody answered. See, he said softly toward Cole. Scared of strangers. Cole studied him a long moment. He had met men like this before. Men who smiled carefully. Men who explained too much before anybody accused them of anything. Ranger stamped once beside him. The horse did not like the riders either. What church? Cole asked. The rider paused half a second too long. St. Matthew's Mission. Never heard of it. Small place. Cole nodded slowly. Funny thing about church folk. The rider's smile thinned slightly. What is that? Usually they feed children. The desert went quiet again. One of the horses farther back tossed its head against the reins. Lantern light flickered across the rocks, throwing long shadows over the basin floor. The lead rider's eyes hardened just a little now. The friendliness started slipping. You traveling alone, mister? Usually. Long way from town. Yep. The rider looked toward the open wagon doors again. Well, appreciate you checking on the little ones. We will take it from here. Behind Cole, somebody inside the wagon whimpered softly. Tiny sound. Tiny enough the riders might not have heard if the night wind had not suddenly died completely still. The lead rider's face changed instantly. Not anger. Worse. Recognition. He knew the children were frightened of him. Cole noticed Noah moving inside the shadows too, positioning himself between the riders and the younger children despite being barely more than a child himself. Cole felt something tighten low in his chest. The same feeling that came before storms and bad decisions. He shifted the rifle slightly in his hands. Slow. Calm. I do not think so, he said quietly. The lantern light flickered across the riders' faces as the entire basin seemed to hold its breath. The lead rider stared at Cole across the frozen basin without blinking. Wind tugged softly at the edges of his gray coat while the lantern hanging from his saddle swayed in slow circles against the dark. Behind him, the other riders shifted uneasily in their saddles now that the easy conversation had died. Cole could feel every child inside the wagon listening to the silence. Friend, the lead rider finally said, still calm. Those children belong with us. Cole rested one hand lightly against the rifle barrel. Children are not cattle. The rider's smile disappeared completely this time. You do not know the situation. I know enough. One of the riders farther back pulled his horse forward slightly. Mister, you ought to mind your own road. Cole never looked away from the leader. Maybe. The man studied him carefully beneath the moonlight. Cole knew the type. Men like this searched for weakness first. They watched hands, eyes, breathing. They wanted to know how badly another man wished to avoid trouble. Usually Cole would have given them the answer they wanted. Usually he would have tipped his hat, mounted Ranger, and ridden north without another word. But then Ellie coughed again behind him. Small weak sound. Barely there. And somehow that tiny cough settled the whole thing inside him. The lead rider heard it too. Little girl sounds sick, he said. We have medicine in camp. Lydia made a frightened sound immediately. No, she whispered from inside the wagon before she could stop herself. Every rider turned toward the voice at once. Cole stepped sideways fast enough to block the wagon opening with his body. That is enough, he said quietly. The lead rider's face hardened now like wet clay drying in the sun. Move aside. Cole did not move. The desert fell silent except for the creak of saddle leather and the restless shifting of horses against frozen dirt. One of the smaller children inside the wagon began crying softly into a blanket. Noah whispered something low trying to calm them, but fear had already spread through the wagon again. The riders heard that too. The lead rider sighed once like a tired schoolteacher dealing with stubborn children. You think you are helping them, he said. You are not. Cole answered without emotion. Funny thing, they do not seem eager to go back. The rider's jaw tightened. Children scare easy. Children usually know who hurts them. That landed harder than the rifle ever could have. The men behind the leader shifted again, nervous now. One looked briefly toward the ridge behind them like he suddenly wished they had never stopped in this basin at all. Cole noticed every bit of it. Fear moved fastest through men who already knew they were wrong. The lead rider finally pulled one glove slowly from his hand. "Name is Vernon Pike," he said. "Maybe you have heard it before." Cole had not. But the way Pike said it told him plenty anyway. A man used to his name changing conversations. "Cannot say I have." Pike looked genuinely surprised by that. "Then let me make this simple. Those children are under my authority. We are transporting them to work ranches north of Flagstaff. Papers signed legal and proper." Noah suddenly spoke from the wagon shadows. "That is a lie." Every head turned toward him. The boy's thin face looked pale beneath the moonlight, but his eyes stayed locked on Pike with fierce hatred far too old for 11 years. "You said families," Noah whispered. "You said there would be families." Pike's expression changed instantly. Cold now. "Empty." "Boy," he said quietly, "you do not understand grown business." Noah held Ellie tighter against his chest. "You sold Tommy." Silence crashed into the basin so hard even the horses seemed to stop moving. Lydia lowered her head immediately like she regretted the words already escaping. One of the younger girls began crying harder into her blanket now. Cole felt something heavy settle into his stomach. Missing children, hidden wagons, desert routes, ranch work. He had heard stories like this whispered in saloons before. Children moved town to town where nobody asked questions too closely. Cheap labor. Invisible lives. Pike's voice came lower now. Dangerous soft. "The boy talks too much." Cole slowly lifted the rifle from his side. Not aimed. Not yet. Just visible. Pike stared at the weapon a long second before laughing once under his breath. Not amused laughter. Frustrated laughter. "You really planning to fight 4 men over a wagon full of orphans?" Cole glanced back once toward the terrified faces crowded together behind him. Lydia trying to comfort the smaller children while trembling herself. Noah holding feverish Ellie close beneath the blanket. Tiny hands gripping torn cloth like it was the last safe thing left in the world. Then he looked back at Pike. "No," Cole said quietly. "I think I am planning to stop pretending I do not see what is happening." For a long moment nobody moved. The moon hung pale above the basin while cold wind whispered through the dry grass around the wagon wheels. Pike stared at Cole with the kind of expression men wore when they realized the situation had slipped beyond easy control. Behind him, one rider shifted his horse sideways nervously and tightened his grip on the reins. The children inside the wagon stayed perfectly still now. Even the crying had stopped. Fear had gone deeper than tears. Pike finally let out a slow breath through his nose. "You do not know what you are stepping into," he said quietly. Cole kept the rifle steady. Across his chest. "Maybe not. Those children were headed north whether you found this wagon or not." Noah's voice came again from the darkness behind Cole. "Tommy cried for his mama the whole first night." Pike's eyes flashed cold toward the wagon instantly. "Enough." Noah did not stop. His face looked pale beneath the moonlight, but something inside the boy had finally broken loose after too many days of silence. "You told him he was going to a family." Lydia grabbed Noah's sleeve softly. "Noah," but the boy kept staring at Pike. "Then those men took him away at the rail station." One of the younger girls began trembling again beneath the blankets. Cole glanced back briefly toward Noah. How many children were there before? Noah swallowed hard. 14. The number settled heavy in the frozen air. Cole slowly looked around the wagon again. 8 children remained. 6 gone. Pike's horse shifted beneath him as if even the animal disliked standing still under those words. "People disappear every day on the frontier," Pike said flatly. "Children die. Families split apart. That is life out here." Cole's jaw tightened. "Not like this." The rider farthest back suddenly leaned toward Pike. "We should go." Fear now. Real fear. Not of Cole exactly. Fear of being seen clearly for the first time. Pike ignored him. His eyes stayed fixed on Cole with growing irritation beneath the calm surface. "You planning to march 8 starving children across the desert by yourself?" he asked. "Little girl in there will not survive half the night." Cole already knew that. Ellie's breathing had worsened over the last few minutes. Thin, weak breaths that rattled softly beneath the blanket Noah wrapped around her. The child needed warmth. Water. A real bed. not a freezing wagon sitting forgotten in the basin. Pike saw the hesitation cross Cole's face and pressed harder immediately. You think wanting to help is enough? He asked quietly. Good intentions do not keep children alive. Cole did not answer right away because the truth of it cut too close. One horse, one rifle, miles from town, 8 frightened children barely able to stand. He had no clean plan, only the growing certainty that leaving them here was impossible. Lydia's voice came softly from the wagon shadows. Mr. Cole. He glanced back toward her. Yeah. You said the door stays open. Her fingers shook around Ellie's tiny hand beneath the blanket. Did you mean it? The question landed harder than Pike's threats ever could have. Cole looked at the children crowded inside the wagon. Dirt-streaked faces, hollow eyes, tiny shoulders pulled tight against the cold. They were waiting for disappointment because disappointment was all they trusted anymore. He had seen people lose faith before, but seeing it inside children felt different somehow. Smaller, sadder, like watching a lantern burn out before sunrise. Ranger suddenly jerked his head toward the ridge and snorted sharply. Cole turned fast. More lanterns flickered faintly along the upper trail. Additional riders. Maybe 3, maybe more. Pike noticed 2 and smiled slightly for the first time in several minutes. Looks like the rest of my crew found us. The fear inside the wagon spread instantly. One little boy buried his face against Lydia's shoulder, whispering over and over, "Please do not let them take us." Noah held Ellie tighter. "We have to go now." Cole looked toward the ridge, then toward the children, then toward the broken wagon, wool buried deep in sand. His mind moved quickly through distances, trails, water routes, canyon paths north of the basin. One choice after another. None good, but staying meant surrender. Pike straightened in his saddle. Confidence returned to his voice now that backup approached through the dark. Last chance, mister. Walk away while you still can. Cole lowered the rifle slightly. Pike's men relaxed just enough to mistake the movement for surrender. Then Cole stepped backward toward Ranger instead of away from the wagon. "Lydia," he said calmly without taking his eyes off the riders. "How many of you can walk?" The entire basin went silent again. Lydia looked around the wagon before answering like she was counting strength instead of children. "Most of us," she whispered finally. "But not far." Cole nodded once. That was enough. He moved fast after that. Calm fast. Purposeful fast. The kind of movement that stopped panic before it spread. He lowered the rifle just long enough to grab 2 more blankets from behind Ranger's saddle. "Wrap the little ones tight," he said toward Lydia and Noah. "Keep their heads covered from the wind." Pike laughed once under his breath, around a little girl no older than 6. The child's bare feet touched the frozen dirt, and she immediately winced from the cold. Cole handed Lydia one of the blankets. "Wrap her feet." Lydia nodded quickly. Her fingers still trembled, but now movement had replaced helplessness. The children finally had something to do besides wait for fear. Noah climbed down last, carrying Ellie against his chest. The little girl looked worse now. Her blonde curls clung damp against her forehead, while her tiny face had gone pale beneath the moonlight. Ellie stirred weakly and whispered something almost too soft to hear. Noah lowered his ear close. "What did she say?" Cole asked. Noah swallowed hard. "She asked if they found us again." The words settled over the basin like frost. Cole looked at Ellie a second before answering firmly enough for all the children to hear. "No." Ellie's eyes never opened, but her breathing eased slightly against Noah's coat. Pike saw it too. Saw the way the children listened to Cole now instead of him. That seemed to anger him more than anything else. "You are making a mistake," Pike snapped. "Those children belong nowhere. Nobody wants a wagon full of starving orphans." Lydia lowered her head instantly at those words like she had heard them too many times before. One little girl began crying silently into the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Cole felt something dark and heavy move through his chest then. Not rage exactly. Sadness sharpened into resolve. He looked directly at Pike for the first time in several minutes. "Funny thing about children," he said quietly. "They start believing what grown men tell them." Pike's expression hardened cold again. "And what exactly are you telling them?" Cole adjusted Samuel higher against his side, while moonlight spread silver across the basin floor around the frightened little group gathered beside him. Then he answered in the same calm voice he had used since opening the wagon doors. "That they are leaving this place alive." The first child moved only after Cole did. Samuel clung tightly against his coat, while Cole stepped backward toward the narrow canyon wash cutting through the north side of the basin. The other children followed slowly behind him, wrapped in torn blankets beneath the cold moonlight like tiny ghosts crossing the desert floor. Lydia stayed close to the smaller girls while Noah carried Ellie carefully in both arms. The little girl's head rested against his shoulder, her breathing thin and uneven beneath the freezing air. Pike watched them go with growing disbelief hardening across his face. "You really think you can disappear with 8 children?" he called after them. Cole kept moving, not planning to disappear. Then what? Cole glanced back once, planning to keep walking. Pike's horse stepped sideways sharply as frustration finally cracked through the man's calm voice. "You are one man." Cole adjusted Samuel higher against his side. "Tonight seems enough." Behind Pike, the new riders finally reached the lower Basin trail. 7 men, now all together. Lanterns swayed through the dark while horses snorted clouds of white breath into the freezing air. The children saw the numbers too. One little girl stumbled immediately from fear more than weakness. Lydia caught her before she hit the dirt. "Keep moving," Cole said quietly. Nobody cried now. The fear had become too large for tears. The wash entrance waited about 50 yards ahead, narrow and winding between steep walls of black rock. If they reached it, the riders would lose sight lines in the dark. Not safety exactly, but distance. Distance mattered. Ranger followed close beside the children, ears pinned nervously toward the horses behind them. Cole listened carefully while walking. No riders charging yet. That told him Pike still believed he could talk this situation back under control. Men like Pike preferred ownership over chaos. Preferred obedience over pursuit. "Mr. Cole," Lydia whispered softly beside him. "Yeah. Where are we going?" Cole looked toward the black canyon ahead. "North first, then east by morning." "Is there a town?" "Eventually." Lydia nodded, though exhaustion weighed heavily across her face now. Her legs shook beneath her thin dress every few steps. The smaller children leaned against one another while walking because none of them had enough strength left to move alone. For long. Behind them, Pike's voice rose again through the basin. "You know what happens when people shelter stolen children." Cole stopped walking for half a second at that word. "Stolen." He turned slowly toward the riders. The moonlight stretched long shadows across the frozen ground between them now. "Children are not stolen property," he said quietly. Pike's expression hardened. "Out here they are whatever papers say they are." Noah's grip tightened around Ellie instantly. The boy looked like he wanted to say something furious back, but Ellie suddenly coughed weakly against his shoulder, and all his attention snapped back to her instead. "Stay with me," Noah whispered softly. Ellie's eyelids fluttered once. "Cold," she breathed. Cole walked back 2 quick steps and pulled his heavy coat from his shoulders without hesitation. The desert air bit instantly through his shirt, but he wrapped the coat carefully around Ellie and tucked the edges close beneath her chin. The little girl disappeared almost completely inside the oversized wool. Noah stared at him in shock. "You will freeze." Cole shook his head once. "I have been colder." Then he looked directly at the rest of the children. "Listen to me now. Nobody stops walking. I do not care how tired you are. We keep moving together." Samuel nodded immediately against Cole's shoulder. Lydia helped another little girl tighten her blanket before continuing forward. Something had changed among the children during those last few minutes. The fear remained, but now it moved beside something else. Tiny. Fragile. Hope. Pike noticed it too. Cole could see the anger growing in the man's face as the children followed him willingly into the dark wash instead of returning to the wagon. "You are making promises you cannot keep," Pike shouted. Cole paused at the edge of the canyon entrance and looked back one final time. 7 riders sat scattered across the moonlit basin behind him, lanterns flickering, horses restless. Pike at the center of them, all like a spider watching prey slip loose from the web. Cole's voice stayed calm when he answered. "Maybe." Then he glanced down toward Samuel pressed tightly against his side. The little boy's freezing fingers still clung to his shirt like he was terrified of being left behind. Cole looked back toward Pike one last time. "But I think those kids heard enough broken promises already." Then he turned and led the children into the darkness of the canyon wash while the riders watched in silence behind them. The canyon swallowed them almost immediately. Moonlight faded behind tall rock walls until only thin silver strips remained overhead like cracks in the sky. The temperature dropped harder inside the wash. Cold air settled low between the stones while every footstep echoed softly through the narrow passage ahead. Cole moved first with Samuel against his side and the rifle resting across his shoulder. Ranger followed close behind the children, the horse careful with each step across loose rock and packed sand. Nobody spoke above a whisper anymore. Fear traveled differently inside the canyon. Smaller sounds carried farther. Ellie coughed once beneath Cole's coat, and Noah tightened the blanket around her immediately. "She is shaking," Noah whispered. Cole glanced back toward the child. Ellie's eyes remained closed, her pale face barely visible inside the heavy wool. "Keep her moving," Cole said quietly. "Do not let her go cold." Noah nodded, though exhaustion dragged at every movement he made. The boy had been carrying responsibility too long for shoulders that small. Lydia stumbled suddenly against the canyon wall and caught herself with one hand before falling. Cole stopped immediately. "You all right?" Lydia nodded too fast. "I am fine." But she was not. None of them were. The little girl beside her looked half asleep while walking. Samuel's fingers still clung tightly to Cole's shirt, like letting go meant disappearing. Even Noah's legs shook beneath Ellie's weight every few steps. Cole studied the children carefully in the darkness. They needed rest soon. Water too. But stopping inside the wash would trap them if Pike followed. And Pike would follow. Men like that never liked losing what they believed belonged to them. Behind them, faint echoes drifted through the canyon entrance. Horses, distant still, but moving. The riders had finally started after them. Lydia heard it too. "They are coming." Cole listened another second before nodding once. "Yeah." One of the younger girls began breathing faster immediately. "I cannot run," she whispered. "I cannot." Lydia wrapped one arm around her shoulders. "You do not have to run. Just keep walking." The little girl shook harder. "What if they catch us?" Silence fell after that question. The children looked toward Cole without meaning to. Waiting again. Always waiting for adults to decide whether the world stayed dangerous or safe. Cole stared ahead into the darkness of the winding wash before answering. "Then they catch me first." Noah looked up sharply at that. "Why?" Cole glanced back at him. "What do you mean, why?" Noah swallowed hard. "Why are you doing this?" The question echoed softly through the narrow canyon. Even the smaller children listened for the answer. Cole walked several more steps before speaking. "Long time ago," he said quietly, "I had a little brother." Lydia looked up from beneath the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Cole kept his eyes forward while talking. "His name was Ben. He got sick during winter up near Colorado territory. Fever came fast." Ellie coughed weakly against Noah's chest, as if the story itself understood her condition. Cole's voice remained calm, but softer now beneath the canyon shadows. Storm blocked the roads. Doctor never made it in time. Nobody spoke. The children only listened to the sound of boots scraping softly against rock, while Cole continued walking ahead of them. "My mother kept saying help was coming." He swallowed once. "But sometimes help comes late." Noah lowered his eyes toward Ellie. Lydia's face tightened quietly in the dark. Cole adjusted Samuel higher against his side. "I think maybe I got tired tonight of seeing children wait for grown folks who never show up." The canyon turned sharply east, then narrowed even further until Ranger barely fit through. Loose stones shifted beneath the horse's hooves. Somewhere ahead, water dripped faintly against rock. Cole slowed instantly. Water meant shelter nearby. Maybe an old spring cut into the canyon wall. Maybe enough to rest the children a few minutes without freezing solid before dawn. Then a sound echoed behind them again. Closer this time. Horses entering the wash. One of the smaller boys whimpered softly. Lydia pulled him close immediately. Cole stopped walking and listened carefully. The riders were moving slower inside the canyon, but they were definitely following now. Pike would not give up easy. Cole looked around the narrow shadows surrounding them. Steep canyon walls. Tight curves. Limited visibility. Hard country for horses at night. Harder country for frightened children. But maybe not impossible. Samuel suddenly lifted his head against Cole's shoulder and pointed weakly ahead into the darkness. "There," he whispered. Cole looked forward. Far down the canyon wall, barely visible between two black rock formations, a tiny warm light flickered softly in the dark. The tiny light flickered weakly against the canyon wall like a candle struggling against the wind. Every child saw it at once. Hope moved through the group, so suddenly it almost looked painful. Samuel lifted his head higher against Cole's shoulder, while Lydia stared toward the glow with wide, exhausted eyes. "Is that a house?" one little girl whispered. Cole narrowed his eyes toward the darkness ahead. The light sat low between two rock formations where the canyon curved sharply east. Not a house exactly. More likely a lined shack or abandoned miner's shelter. But it was shelter. And right now shelter mattered more than answers. Behind them, the distant sound of horses scraping through the canyon echoed again. Closer now. Pike's riders were taking their time, but they were still coming. Cole shifted Samuel carefully to his other arm and looked at the children. "Stay together," he said quietly. "Nobody falls behind." The group moved faster, now despite exhaustion dragging at every step. Fear chased them from behind, while that tiny warm light pulled them forward through the cold canyon dark. Ellie stirred weakly beneath Cole's coat wrapped around her shoulders. Noah adjusted her carefully against his chest. "She is hot," he whispered. Cole touched the little girl's forehead briefly as they walked. Fever still burned hard beneath her skin. Too long in the cold. Too little food. Too much fear. Just a little farther. Cole said softly, though he was not sure whether he meant it for Ellie or himself. The canyon narrowed again before suddenly opening into a small hidden pocket between the rocks. There, tucked beneath an overhang of black stone, stood a tiny weathered cabin no bigger than a stable shed. One window glowed dim gold through dusty glass. Smoke drifted weakly from a crooked stovepipe into the freezing night air. Every child stopped walking at the sight of it. Real warmth. Real light. Lydia covered her mouth with one trembling hand like she did not trust herself to believe it. Noah stared toward the cabin door without moving. "Someone lives here," he whispered. Cole studied the place carefully. Old but maintained. Water barrel outside. Firewood stacked against one wall. A mule tied beneath a lean-to shelter nearby. Whoever lived here had not left long ago. Ranger snorted softly behind them and lowered his head toward the water barrel immediately. Then the cabin door opened. Every child flinched at once. An old man stepped into the lantern light, holding a shotgun low against one arm. Gray beard. Heavy wool coat. One bad leg dragging slightly behind the other. His eyes moved first to Cole, then to the children crowded behind him beneath the canyon shadows. The old man blinked once slowly. "Good Lord." Cole kept his hands visible. "Evening." The old man looked again at the children. Tiny faces pale with exhaustion. Torn blankets. Bare feet. Ellie unconscious against Noah's shoulder. Whatever suspicion he might have had disappeared immediately. "Get them inside," he said without hesitation. "Quick now, before they freeze solid." The children did not move right away. Too many broken promises. Too many dangerous adults. Cole looked back toward Lydia first. "It is all right." Lydia studied his face carefully before finally nodding once to the others. That was all it took. The smallest children moved first toward the cabin door, slow and uncertain like stray animals approaching kindness for the first time. Warm yellow light spilled across their faces as they stepped inside. One little boy started crying softly the second he smelled soup cooking somewhere near the stove. The old man lowered the shotgun completely and stared at him in heartbreak. Sweet mercy. Cole followed the children inside, last while listening carefully toward the canyon behind them. The riders were still out there somewhere beyond the dark curves of rock. But for the first time all night, the children stood beneath a roof instead of inside a locked wagon. The cabin smelled like wood smoke, coffee, and beans simmering slowly in an iron pot near the stove. Real warmth wrapped around the room instantly. Lydia nearly stumbled from the sudden heat after hours in the freezing desert air. Noah lowered Ellie carefully onto a small cot near the fire while the old man crossed the room quickly with blankets in both arms. "Name is Walter," he said. "You kids sit yourselves down before your legs quit on you." One little girl touched the edge of the wooden table like she had forgotten furniture could belong inside safe places. Samuel still clung tightly to Cole's coat while staring wide-eyed at the fire glowing orange inside the stove. Cole finally set the rifle gently against the wall beside the door and looked around the tiny cabin full of frightened, exhausted children warming themselves beside real light for the first time in days. Then from somewhere deep in the canyon outside came the faint echo of horses stopping. The cabin went silent the second the horses stopped outside. Every child froze where they sat. Lydia's spoon slipped halfway back toward the bowl in her hands. Noah looked sharply toward the door while tightening his arms around Ellie lying beneath blankets on the cot beside the stove. Even Walter stopped moving near the firewood stack, one weathered hand still gripping another log against his chest. The sound outside came again. Leather creaking softly. Horses breathing in the cold. Men dismounting. Cole stood near the door without speaking for several seconds. Firelight flickered across the cabin walls while the children watched him with wide, frightened eyes. They were waiting again, waiting to see if safety could disappear as quickly as it appeared. Walter lowered the firewood carefully beside the stove. "You know these men?" he asked quietly. Cole nodded once. "Enough." Walter glanced toward the children before looking back at the door. "Then they are not stepping inside." Cole almost smiled at that. Almost. Outside, boots scraped softly against frozen ground. Then came Pike's voice through the canyon darkness. "Cole Mercer. Come again. Too calm. I know you are in there." Samuel moved closer against Cole's side immediately. The little boy's fingers wrapped tightly around the edge of Cole's shirt like he already knew what grown men shouting outside usually meant. Cole rested one hand gently against the child's shoulder. "It is all right." But Samuel did not look convinced. Neither did the others. Pike spoke again from outside. "This can still end easy." Noah let out a bitter laugh from beside Ellie's cot. Small sound. Too old for a child. Walter noticed it. So did Cole. Pike waited a few seconds before continuing. "You are cold. Kids are exhausted. Nobody wants trouble tonight." Lydia lowered her eyes toward the bowl in her lap. The word trouble probably sounded familiar too. The kind adults used right before children got hurt. Cole finally stepped toward the cabin door. Walter reached for the shotgun, resting near the wall. Cole shook his head once. "No," Walter frowned. "There are 7 of them." "Yeah. And one of you." Cole looked around the tiny cabin then. At the frightened children wrapped in blankets beside the stove. At Noah sitting beside Ellie with one protective hand still resting gently over the little girl's blanket. At Lydia, trying hard to appear brave for the younger ones despite exhaustion pulling at her eyes. For the first time in years, the old loneliness inside Cole felt smaller than the room around him. He reached for the door handle slowly. Samuel grabbed his sleeve immediately. "Do not go." Cole looked down at the child. Samuel's face looked terrified now. Not of Pike exactly. Of being abandoned again. Cole crouched carefully beside him. "Listen to me, partner." Samuel's small fingers tightened harder around the fabric of his shirt. "I am not leaving." The little boy searched his face several seconds. Before finally loosening his grip, Cole stood and opened the cabin door. Cold canyon air rushed inside immediately, carrying the smell of horses and dust. Pike stood 20 feet from the porch beneath the moonlight with the other riders spread behind him between the rocks. Lantern light flickered softly across their faces. Walter stepped up beside Cole with the shotgun resting low against one arm anyway. Pike noticed. "Evening, Walter." Walter spat into the dirt. "Never was much of one till you showed up." One of the riders shifted uncomfortably behind Pike. Cole noticed several of them avoiding eye contact with the cabin windows now. They had heard the children inside. Heard coughing, crying, tiny voices. Harder to pretend things were business after that. Pike looked past Cole toward the warm cabin light behind him. "You know what happens next?" Cole answered quietly. "No, but I know what is not happening next." Pike's jaw tightened. "You really ready to die over this?" The canyon fell silent after that question. Wind moved softly through the rocks above them, while somewhere behind the cabin a mule shifted against its rope. Cole looked back once through the open door toward the children inside. Lydia watching from the table with frightened eyes. Noah sitting beside Ellie. Samuel clutching the warm bowl Walter had given him like it was treasure. Tiny exhausted faces finally sitting near firelight instead of darkness. Then Cole looked back toward Pike beneath the moon. "No," he said calmly. "I think I am finally ready to live with myself." Something changed in the canyon after those words. Not dramatic. Small. One rider lowered his eyes. Another shifted back toward his horse. Pike saw it too. Fear moved quickest once decent men started remembering they still had decency left. The silence stretched several more seconds before Walter suddenly spoke beside Cole. "Sheriff out of Dry Creek rides through here every Thursday morning." Pike's expression darkened slightly. Walter continued calmly. "And I reckon he might find this whole story mighty interesting." One of Pike's men cursed softly beneath his breath. Another glanced back toward the trail north. The group no longer looked united now. Just tired men standing in cold darkness, while a cabin full of starving children sat visible behind the people protecting them. Pike stared at Cole one long final moment. Then his eyes shifted toward the open wagon chain still hanging from Cole's saddleback beside Ranger. The broken lock gleamed faintly beneath the moonlight. Proof. Pike exhaled slowly through his nose. This is not over. Cole's voice stayed steady. For them it is. Pike held his stare another second before finally turning his horse without another word. One by one the riders followed him back into the canyon shadows until only fading hoofbeats remained beneath the freezing desert sky. Inside the cabin, nobody moved at first. The children simply listened to the silence left behind. Real silence this time. Not fierce silence. Safe silence. Then Ellie stirred weakly beneath the blankets and whispered one tiny sleepy question into the warm firelit room. They gone. Noah looked toward Cole standing in the open doorway beneath the moonlight. Cole glanced once more toward the empty canyon before quietly closing the cabin door behind him. Yeah, he said softly. They are gone.